David. Hello, good morning, Fabio. David, I believe
hi,
you
hi, hi, Anna. Hi, hi.
Hello, my sincere apologies that I'm late. I was lost in the virtual corridors of Zoom, so I'm sorry. Just trying to get the right link.
No problem,
Good morning to everyone. Hello, David. I really apologize for being late. Just having a bit of confusion here with the link. So good morning, everyone. Let's get started. It is a pleasure to be here. Welcome everyone who's watching us, and welcome to you, David, Fabio, and also Carlos Peixoto. I'm going to have just a few words to introduce the chamber, to introduce myself. So I am Anna Paula Vitelli, president at the chamber. And it is an honor to mention here to our attendees that Britcham's mission is to be the reference of the UK and Brazil business community, providing a relevant forum to foster bilateral trade, investment services, and relationships. We operate in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Paraná, and Minas Gerais, and being part of the chamber means having the opportunity of networking with companies and executives in Brazil and in the UK. Then I'd like to thank to Britcham supporting members whose brands were publicized on the opening slide of this session. Then thank to Fabio Caldas and Bruno Marcondes, President and Vice President of the Chamber in Rio de Janeiro. Then, of course, Carlos Peixoto, Vlamir Martins, and Renato Cordeiro, who lead, along with Fabio Caldas, our energy committees. Thank you to, my thanks also go to Shell for the partnership and for the opportunity for us to bring such a great speaker to our webinar. And of course, thank you, David Hone, who's the Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell, for accepting our invitation to bring such a relevant content to our audience. It is an honor to have you here with us. Thank you very much for your time and availability. Wish you all a great conversation. And Fabio, I then pass this on to you. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Anna, our president, for the opening remarks. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning, David. We've spoken before. Good to see you back. Again, you know, after some years, isn't it? We did some work together in the past. Look, I'm the president of Britcham Rio de Janeiro and also president of the Power and Renewables Committee. Now, I would like to thank as well, in addition to Anna, to Britcham supporting members. You saw the brands, you know, in the slides, in the opening slides of the seminar, of this webinar. And also to Bruno Marcondes as well, you know, the VP of Britcham Rio, Peixoto, Vlamir, Renato, they are all, Renato from the UK government. We have a lot of support from HMG, Her Majesty's government, in the chamber's activities. So also a special thanks to the Shell team, Monique, Mariana, and Hannah, and Britcham staff, Fabricio, Clara, Mayra, and Leticia for the support. Also to André Araújo, you know, the president of Shell in Brazil, because I know that he supported this event as well. Right, David, and of course to you, I've already said. Look, this webinar is being streamed live through Zoom, here is in which we are, and also on the YouTube channel of Britcham. The video will remain available after the webinars for those who cannot. I'll go through my social networks and make sure that that's also communicated. Many people are not here, but later I have a number of zaps here. People will watch it later, normally in the hundreds that happens, the key events of the chamber. This is a key event. We're gonna have the speaker's presentation followed by the Q&A. As usual, I count on your understanding, you know, the Q&A session, the preference will be to Britcham members, you know, the associates. The questions cannot be made through the chat feature. You see at the bottom, it's going to be through the Q&As, and I will moderate it only through the Zoom platform, not YouTube. We do not moderate in YouTube. And, you know, several people several people send me zaps, during here. People send me, I may miss some of them. I will ask members when they do the Qs, the question to mention name and company before sending it. That's important to identify the person. And of course, please do ask questions. Please do ask questions. Take the opportunity. There is encyclopedic knowledge here in front of me. This Australian speaker, I know there is, and we work together. Don't miss the opportunity to make questions. Look, I will moderate, and there is a time constraint here. We're going to finish at 11 sharp. And I apologize in advance for questions that cannot be answered, cannot be addressed. And you saw the number of Britcham's committees and discussion groups that they were rolling on the screen. There are several fronts and opportunities for your business. You saw the subjects and names of the leaders who had them. To learn more about these committees, about these activities, please just visit the Chamber's website at www.britcham.com.br. The Chamber is boosting with activity now, doing advocacy, CEO events, committees working together, etc. It's quite a momentous time for the Chamber. Now, you don't want to hear me anymore. I'm going to read the bio and then I pass it over to David. He works for Shell International Limited and is a chief climate change advisor in the Shell Scenarios team. He joined Shell in 1980 after graduating as a chemical engineer from the University of Adelaide in Australia. He has worked in refinery technology, oil trading, and shipping areas for Shell. David is a board member of the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA, was chairman of IETA from 2011 to 13, and is a board member of C2ES in Washington and GCCSI in Melbourne, the Global CCS Institute in Melbourne. David is a regular climate blogger. His blog can easily be found in the internet, and is the author of a great book. It's quite a summary of 2017 on climate change, Putting the Genie Back, Solving the Climate and Energy Dilemma. David, the floor is all yours. Good luck there.
Right, thank you, Fabio, and thanks to everybody for joining today. So let me just share my screen. So as Fabio said, I work in the Shell Scenarios team. The Shell Scenarios team recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. So this is an area that is important in Shell. It's a guide to our own strategic planning, and it helps inform that strategic planning for the years ahead. Earlier this year, we released a new set of scenarios, the energy transformation scenarios, and these were built out of scenarios that we did last year that looked at how the world might emerge from the pandemic. So I'm going to start off shortly in the world of the pandemic and quickly work into the energy world and look at how this transformation might proceed through to 2100. First of all, it's important to recognize that this is a scenario presentation, so it contains a number of forward-looking statements. As such, this should not be used as a basis for investing in Shell equities. So we're going to have a bit of an introduction. As I said, look at COVID-19, energy transformation, look at the energy trends within that, and then how might this transformation progress? And they're the 5 parts of the talk. And then we'll have, as Fabio said, time for Q&A at the end. So I thought I'd start this story back in 1912. And this is a picture I found of Rio de Janeiro in 1912 that you can see from the coastline what it looks like, but not certainly a fraction of the city that's there today. And in 1912, if you'd visited a country town in my part of the world, in Australia, this is a small country town that you would find there. And this is a town called Braidwood in New South Wales. And in July 1912, if you'd happened to be there and opened up the the newspaper, the Braidwood Dispatch, and I think it was in mid-July 1912, you would have found this article. And this was an article about how the consumption of coal had reached such a level that it was starting to affect the atmosphere. And in 1912, they thought that the effect may be considerable in a few centuries in terms of temperature rise. Of course, little did they imagine the scale of the energy system that has developed in 110 years, and that the effect is not considerable in a few centuries, but considerable in 1 century. And of course, as we know, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere continues to rise. This is up to the beginning of 2021 from Mauna Leo, from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Very familiar chart, I think, to everybody. Maybe what's not quite so familiar is, where does this CO2 come from? So the bulk of it, of course, is from the extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. That combustion releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's important to recognize, though, about 10% of the fossil fuels that are extracted the carbon ends up in goods that we keep in society, so it doesn't end up in the atmosphere. These can be manufactured items, bitumen on roads, all sorts of things. Now, another 6 gigatons, and that's the bulk of the CO2, but another 6 gigatons of CO2 makes its way into the atmosphere because of global deforestation. And I know that's a key issue in Brazil. And then a further 2 gigatons makes its way into the atmosphere through the extraction of limestone and the conversion of limestone to cement. And in that conversion process, you release carbon dioxide, and that's fossil carbon as well. Now, there's a fourth release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is from our use of biofuels, a big industry in Brazil, the bioethanol industry. Sugarcane is grown and it's converted to ethanol. When that ethanol is combusted, it releases CO2 into the atmosphere. But of course, that same CO2 is absorbed by the sugarcane when it's grown. So that's a closed cycle of carbon dioxide. And that's an important building block for the future, because we will come back to how important that is. And so, as we know, that this is leading to a continuing warming trend. We're at about 1.2 degrees C of warming versus 1850 to 1900. That's the scale on the right-hand side. And we also know that the trend is about 0.2 degrees C per decade. That means that the goal of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degrees C goal, is reached in the mid-2030s. That is very close. We are knocking on the door of 1.5 degrees C. Now, as a result of this and many other things, the external landscape globally is changing very rapidly. There's legislation around climate. There's environmental issues and environmental stress arising from climate. Of course, there's COVID-19, which has had a big impact on the global energy system. But there's also the march of energy technology, rapidly bringing us new ways of generating energy and new ways of consuming energy. But I wanted to start with a focus on COVID-19, because this is a big enough event to have upended the global system, and it will change the world in ways that may last for decades. And we looked at this last year in the scenarios team, and we identified 3 tensions at play. There's the wealth first tension. This is the desire of governments to quickly rebuild the global economy and to get back onto the GDP curve, the GDP growth curve, and to reestablish all of their industries and to go back to the high levels of employment. And you've already seen that this is being pushed, for instance, through the United States infrastructure bill, which is really targeting rebuilding of the US and generating lots of jobs. Now, there's another tension at play, which is security. This is countries concerned about the spread of COVID-19 and what it means for them, and they've become quite inward looking and maybe not, and actually dropped their level of international cooperation. My own country, Australia, is struggling with this issue because it initially closed its borders, kept COVID out, and now is struggling with a rising caseload. But many countries are looking to their own internal matters first before they look at the need for global cooperation to actually solve the pandemic issue. And the third tension coming out of this is a recognition by not just government, but society more broadly, that the health and well-being of society needs to be the most important priority going forward. And this isn't just the health of people as a result of COVID. This is the general health of society, the health of the environment, the health of people, and the health more broadly. So these three tensions are playing out, and they have different impacts on the energy system. Now, we've translated these into three long-term energy scenarios: waves, islands, and Sky 1.5. And they're built on this wealth first, security first, or health first tension as the predominant tension in each of the three scenarios. So let me take you through those quickly, and then we'll start to look at the trends that emerge from them. In the wealth first scenario, as I said, the emphasis is on repairing the economy. The result of this is a surge in energy use and emissions. But the issues that existed in the 20-teens, in 2015, 2016, 2019, they're still there. Growing inequality, more frequent and extreme weather events. And as a result of this, the social pressures around these issues intensify because they're still not being addressed. The focus is on wealth and rebuilding. And so as we approach the 2030s, we get a backlash and a rapid policy-driven reduction in fossil fuels. It's not about emissions management, it's about ending fossil fuel use. Now, because of the late start, this scenario doesn't meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, but it does reach net zero emissions near the end of the century and stabilize temperatures at 2.3 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. So about 1 degree above where we are today. Now that has real implications, but nevertheless, it does resolve the climate issue at some level. In the island scenario, the focus is on national interests, and therefore growing nationalism becomes a trend. This leads to frictions around all sorts of collaboration and around trade. Economies stagnate to some extent, and the growth in energy demand is weak. It almost stalls. Because of the lack of global collaboration, global climate action slows. It doesn't stop. There are still parts of the world that are making their own national progress on changing the energy mix, but it doesn't have that impetus of countries working together. And it doesn't have that impetus of clean technology quite quickly coming through, so it makes slower progress as well. And by the end of the century, although emissions are falling, we're still not at net zero emissions. And so by 2100, the temperature rise is 2.5 degrees, and there's still a bit more to go. Emissions are coming down quite quickly by then, but we're not going to plateau the temperature until well into the 22nd century. And then finally, in the third scenario, Sky 1.5, this is where society recognizes the need for the broader well-being as being most important. Economies open up quite slowly in this story. They proceed cautiously, and governments cooperate to ensure that there's no rebound back into the pandemic. They learn quickly that there's a recognition of value in working together in these alignments. And the stimulus bills are flavored green. They start to reshape the energy system. But they build on the deep structural changes that have taken place in society as a result of this long period, not of lockdown, but of changed work practices and changed domestic practices. In slowly reopening, we can imagine that we proceed with caution, not just in 2021, but in 2022 and 2023. It's a slow reopening. And so we really start to change the way in which we live and the way in which society operates, because we have to. And it's this scenario that has the potential to deliver the goals of the Paris Agreement. There's a focus on emissions. There's a focus on the broader well-being of society. And there's good, strong international collaboration and cooperation develops. So these are the three scenarios we're going to talk through: waves, islands, and Sky 1.5. Waves, a delayed move to new energy sources and carriers. Islands is a very slow shift from oil, coal, and gas. And Sky, although it moves to new energy sources, the big focus is on reducing emissions quickly. Now, the energy trends within them are very important. In all three scenarios, the energy trend, the energy system becomes more efficient. But in all three scenarios, energy consumption will grow. And just for clarity, there's going to be a few charts like this. The thick bands represent the breadth between the three scenarios. It doesn't always mean that Sky's on top and islands is at the bottom. It's just illustrative that all three scenarios are contained within each of those bands. So if you look at the yellow one, that's energy demand. In that particular case, you do have islands at the bottom, you have waves at the top, and Sky is somewhere in the middle. So all three scenarios see energy per GDP falling, breaking the link between energy demand and growth, but not completely. And in particular, in economies that are still developing, or in the least developed economies, particularly in Africa, there's huge latent energy demand waiting to move forward. And that's where you get the biggest energy growth. Now, all three scenarios also see an expansion of the electricity system. And in particular, an expansion not just of the use of electricity, but the way in which we generate electricity from renewable energy sources. If we can change the use, if we can change final energy from, for instance, gasoline to electricity, as you do when you buy an electric car, you move any source of emissions from where the energy service is delivered, which in this case is the car, back upstream to where the electricity is generated. And when you do that with renewable energy, of course, you get no emissions at all. If you still do it with fossil fuels, for instance, natural gas, you could capture and geologically store the carbon dioxide, technology known as CCS. All three of these see a progression in the use of electricity, but it's in the Sky 1.5 scenario that there's a real trend break from where we've been and a rapid change in the rate of electricity uptake. Over the last 50 to 100 years, the amount of electricity that we use in final energy has been growing at a rate of about 2 percentage points per decade. Today, in 2020, we were at 20% of final energy was electricity. That means 80% of the energy we use was molecular fuels, like gasoline, like natural gas, like coal in an industrial furnace. 10 years ago, that was 18%. 10 years before that, it was 16% and so on. In the Sky 1.5 scenario, you've got to see that suddenly shift from 2 percentage points per decade to about 7 percentage points per decade. And it's driven by this huge installation rate of renewable energy, particularly solar and wind. But nuclear also plays a role here. And the supply of solar and wind varies between the scenarios, but it's vital to the decarbonization goals. It takes a long time to get going in the islands scenario. In the Sky scenario, you've got the fastest early uptake, but in the wave scenario, later on, it overtakes Sky. And that's because of the push to move away from fossil fuels completely, to do everything ultimately with electricity or with hydrogen, for instance, delivered by electricity. And an example of that is the rise of electric vehicles. Now, electric vehicles is one way of turning a molecular energy service, cars use gasoline, into an electrical energy service. And in all three scenarios, electric vehicles rise, but in the sky scenario, you get a very early acceleration of electric vehicle use. Nevertheless, this isn't just about a shift to electricity. The fuels that we've known from the past remain important. These are molecular fuels. And molecular fuels are important because they're perfect for certain transport applications. You know, in this century, it's unlikely we're going to be running big planes on electricity. So we use jet fuel because it has very high energy density and it's very compact and easy, relatively easy to carry around. So it's perfect for these types of big transport systems. Now, as I said, today we're about 80% molecular fuels. By the end of the century, this is the wave scenario that I put up for illustration, where well over 50% of electricity is final energy. But the molecular fuels, the gaseous fuels, the liquid fuels remain important, but they shift within themselves. So for instance, the gaseous fuels shift from natural gas to more hydrogen. The liquid fuels shift from gasoline, so oil-based products, to bio-based products. And of course, as I said, electricity consumption comes predominantly from renewable sources. Now, within all of this, oil demand in all the scenarios peaks at some point in the next 2 decades. And then it declines as it is replaced, but it's not just replaced by electricity. Biofuels also start to become a large part of the energy system. And this is because they have no net impact on CO2 in the atmosphere when they're produced and consumed. And as long as we can produce and consume biofuels sustainably, they offer a way in which we can use these important fuels in the energy system in the future. And even more importantly, it's about the type of biofuels we make. Today, predominantly ethanol, but in the future, you're going to be using biofuels mainly in these transport sectors like aviation, marine, heavy trucks, and that's not ethanol. So it is biofuels, but it's not ethanol, and I think that's important for Brazil as well. Now, what does this, of course, mean for oil production, for investment in the oil industry? Another area that's important for Brazil. You might think, well, if oil is going to peak, then we don't need to do anything. But have a look at this chart. On the far left line, the green line, that represents the natural decline in global oil production if there was no further investment at all. As if we did nothing. And what you see is a very rapid decline in field production. And in fact, that decline is much faster than any of the declines in the 3 scenarios. So that implies that you at least have to maintain brownfield investment. So this is investing in existing production facilities to keep them at the maximum level of production that they have done in the past. But even with brownfield investment, we don't get enough oil to even meet the sky scenario. And so what you need is at least some continued greenfield investment. And it's a question as to how long we need this for to maintain the industry at a level that meets the falling level of demand. It will be a very different industry in the future, but it's not one that vanishes anytime soon. Now, gaseous fuels also remain important for similar reasons as for oil. Gas is ideally placed for the industrial sector. It delivers very high heat loads into furnaces. That's difficult to replicate in all circumstances with electricity. Very high temperatures that may not be possible with the current generation of electric furnaces, or at least may be very expensive with the current generation of electric furnaces. And so natural gas continues, but it eventually starts to decline, although later than oil. But hydrogen generated through electrolysis using renewable energy from water, so this is green hydrogen, in combination with biogas, so this is biomethane, fills the needs of industry in particular, and some in the power generation, and gives us a different fuel mix. So these gaseous fuels also remain important. And hydrogen is a really interesting part of the overall trend to look at. You know, globally, hydrogen is used at quite significant levels in many industrial processes, but we don't use it as a fuel, or at least hardly at all. And so we've got to deliver an entire new industry in 20 years. I think it's interesting if you look at other times when industries have been developed, and there are two examples here, the LNG industry, and we've imagined that that's starting around about now. Imagine if you were starting the LNG industry today at the same rate that it historically started, and you were starting the solar PV industry today at the same rate that it historically started. So that is the two lines, LNG and solar PV, and the rate at which we need to see hydrogen develop in the sky and the wave scenario is similar to that sort of rate. It's a bit faster in the sky scenario, and that's ultimately eclipsed by the wave scenario where hydrogen becomes very big. But we're in the same ballpark as the rate at which these other industries have historically developed. So this is doable. This can be done. Now we come to managing emissions, and this is particularly important in the sky scenario. Not so much in the wave scenario where carbon capture and storage hardly takes place, and in the island scenario where it eventually takes place very late. Now in the sky scenario, we see the use of bioenergy in combination with carbon capture and storage, creating a negative emissions energy carrier. Now, what do I mean by that? When you grow a crop, or like sugarcane, or you grow biomass, you absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In the process of delivering that as an energy carrier and then ultimately using it as an energy carrier, you release the carbon dioxide back again. I talked about this earlier. In the process of, in one of those steps, if you capture the carbon dioxide and geologically store it, you know, up to 3 kilometers below the surface, you're effectively delivering energy, but with negative CO2. You're withdrawing CO2, or at least some CO2, from the atmosphere. And that can be used to set against places where CO2 emissions continue, for instance, in the aviation sector. So these air capture technologies are very important. And there's a number of ways of doing this. And there's even ways of doing air capture without using bioenergy, just literally capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. But this is the way we use in this is the mechanism we use in the sky scenario. And what we see is that going forward, both technological and natural sinks will be critical to achieving net zero emissions, but very critical to achieving 1.5 degrees C, which is the stretch goal of the Paris Agreement. We can see that in Sky 1.5, you're looking at very large scale deployment of carbon capture and storage, but you're also looking at a very rapid end to deforestation and actually significant reforestation on a global level. And the amount of reforestation that you need on a global level to help balance the overall atmospheric condition and achieve a goal of 1.5 is like reforesting an area the size of Brazil. So that's not all in Brazil, that's globally, but it's that equivalent area. But of course, the big task, and which all three scenarios require, is an end to deforestation first. That practice has to stop, and it has to stop in all the scenarios to reach net zero emissions. Now, the sky scenario, that reaches net zero emissions very quickly, before 2060. The wave scenario, around about 2100, and the island scenario also reaches net zero emissions, but not until about 2130, somewhere around there. In fact, it looks as if all energy scenarios going forward reach net zero emissions. The energy transition has shifted the game far enough for that to be an outcome that we're fairly sure of. It's just a question of when it happens. Now, you remember this is the chart I showed at the beginning of the sources of carbon dioxide in 2020. So try and keep that in your head. I know it's a complicated picture, but in the Sky 1.5 scenario in 2060, net zero emissions looks like this. This is a much more complex energy system than the one we have today. So here we are in 2020, and here we are in 2060. We're still extracting quite a lot of fossil fuel. More and more of it is going into products. A large chunk of it is being used, for instance, in industrial systems with carbon capture and storage. But there's still net emissions of fossil carbon to the atmosphere. And how's that managed? Well, there are two ways. One is very large scale reforestation that I talked about. And the other is developing an even larger bioenergy industry and linking that with carbon capture and storage, so we get net negative emissions from the bioenergy system. And across all of this, you get a balance of net zero emissions by 2060. And of course, the amount of fossil fuels continues to shrink, but this is just a snapshot in 2060. This is not the end of the transition, it's a snapshot of when you reach net zero emissions. Of course, the non-emitting sector has grown very large. In terms of temperature, we've talked a lot about this, but you can see here is Sky 1.5. It overshoots 1.5 degrees. That's because we are so close to that today. I don't think that we can reduce emissions fast enough to keep us below 1.5, but we can recover. And by the end of the century, see a 1.5 degrees C outcome. Waves, as I said, is plateaued around 2.3, and islands still rising a little bit at the end of the century. I think it plateaus around 2.6, 2.7 as you get into the 22nd century. None of the scenarios go above 3, and they certainly don't go to the temperatures that we've been talking about in recent years of 4 or 5 degrees C. The transition is taking care of that, and it's already changed the outcome for the future. And I think there's potential to change it further. So this is just a quick summary of the 3 scenarios. All 3 exhibit very similar traits. All 3 see solar becoming the largest energy source. All 3 reach net zero emissions. All of them see a growing role of electrification, of hydrogen emerging in areas like aviation and shipping. It's just a question of when this happens. Does it happen in the 2030s and 2040s? Or are we waiting all the way out till the next century before we see hydrogen fuel planes taking off from the airports in Brazil? And that, of course, depends to some extent on how we emerge from this pandemic. Now, accelerating this energy transformation, it's really about building a virtuous cycle of change between government, business, and consumer. All 3 play a critical role. You can't just leave it to the government or assume that business will take care of it, or think that consumers will just change their habits and everything's all right. All 3 of these have to work together. And the sorts of changes that are necessary are around setting binding targets, using carbon pricing, rewiring the economy with infrastructure for low carbon electricity, getting sectors to cooperate to build new solutions. You know, the aviation sector is not going to shift to hydrogen just because Boeing thinks it's a good idea. There has to be fuel providers that provide the hydrogen. There have to be airports that have to be changed to be able to refuel using hydrogen. And of course, Boeing is just the builder of the airframe. Other companies like Pratt & Whitney and Rolls-Royce have to develop engines that burn hydrogen. So sectoral transformations are important. And thirdly, societal support. You know, we can do lots if we just raise the price of everything, but that's going to end in tears. You will not get societal support if we just push prices up. And there are going to be transition frictions as industries change their shape. And that has to be managed too. So these are the sorts of things that need to be done to create an effective policy framework going forward. So what are the big conclusions from the energy transformation scenarios? Energy needs will grow. I think that's certain. And it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to grow in every country, but globally energy demand will grow. And it will grow because there's many people moving up the energy ladder and up the growth ladder, but there's also new energy services appearing. We've now got a handful of companies wanting to sell us trips into orbit. That's quite an energy intensive business. Now it's very small at the moment, but aviation was pretty small in 1920, and look at it today. So the energy system will be transformed. It's a question of how fast it happens. The transformation will have costs and benefits to society. They need to be managed. And there are accelerators that are necessary to meet the very stringent climate aspirations of the Paris Agreement. We can't just wait and let the economy take its course. It will take its course, but that won't contain this to well below 2 degrees C or 1.5 degrees C. So there's a wealth of material online about these scenarios. I'd encourage you to visit the Shell Scenarios site, not just about global scenarios, but we've got scenario sketches for the EU, for the US. There's one coming for China. There's a new one for India, and we're working on another one for the Asian region as well. So there's lots of material there to look at, and also have a look at our COVID scenarios from last year. So thank you very much, and back to our moderator to run the Q&A.
Thank you very much, David. Fantastic. This spider graph in the end, you know, I'm a fan of it. I like that very much indeed, you know, quite a summary in the end. Look, I have a number of questions here. The first one, I'll go straight to this, is from André Araújo, the president of Shell in Brazil. David, I know you keep rechecking scenarios versus energy development. Is there anything that surprised Shell since the Power Progress issued in February? This is the first one. Then I have some 3 or 4 more.
So the Powering Progress is the name of Shell's strategy. It's about, you know, re-engineering Shell for the future to be partly an electricity company, to continue for some time in oil and gas, but to really start to rebuild the company to meet the transition. I mean, I'd say that, like everybody else, we're always surprised by almost everything that goes on. But I think, you know, the Powering Progress structure has had this scenario input into it, and I think that we're still, you know, well and truly within the framework that I talked about. We're not seeing the world head off into some other completely unexpected direction. I think the thing that will continually surprise us is the rates of change. I think in some areas it's going to be very fast, perhaps even faster than some of our scenarios are showing. And in some areas where perhaps we have great expectations, it may not be as fast as we expect. And so keeping our eye on this pace of change, I think, is really going to be the challenge. And it's, as I said, in both ways, faster and slower.
Thank you very much, David. Look, I'm dealing here with the question. There's another one from Mr. Richard Taylor from Clean Star Brazil Climate. Congratulations. You talked about uncertainty. My question is, what do you believe are the main areas of uncertainty in the climate science driving our net zero activities? And then he makes a notice here.
Yeah,
I'm asking
I read that. Yeah.
Yeah, you read that. Just go ahead.
So certainly this isn't a question about whether the science is true. It's a question to understand the variability.
Yep.
I think, a month ago, we saw the IPCC launch the first part of their sixth assessment report. And one of the aspects that they really focused on was the uncertainty. And in fact, they've largely done away with it. They've narrowed the level of uncertainty, and there's a high level of certainty around the relationship between carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere and the rising temperature. I think the uncertainty that used to exist around that has been narrowed considerably. They've also lowered the level of uncertainty around the relationship between rising temperature and sea level. So they were fairly clear on the rates of sea level change, and also the prospect of sea level rise, not just this century, but going forward over the next few hundred years. And it's not just a few centimeters, it's ultimately it could be many meters. And that's a profound legacy that the 21st century is leaving to our descendants. I think the area of uncertainty that remains is, for a given rise in temperature, how does the climate really react? And it certainly is changing. There's no question about that. We're seeing, many of the things that were talked about 10 and 20 years ago are happening today. But that remains the most complex area to really understand, what, and particularly regional uncertainty. So, what does that mean for the western part of Brazil or the eastern part of Brazil? There's good modeling around this now, but as you start to think more regionally, it becomes more and more difficult to pin this down. So long answer, but that's really where the IPCC landed.
Thank you, David. There's another one from Carlos Peixoto, the head of the Oil and Gas Committee at Britcham. Water supply, people are just congratulating you for the presentation all around. Water supply has been a critical issue on a worldwide basis. Water electrolysis is being viewed as a solution for decarbonizing the energy sector. What is your view on this apparent paradox?
So I think they're on two completely different scales. The amount of water you need to electrolyze to make hydrogen is, I think, very small compared to the amount of water that we consume for all the other activities. And there's even work going on, and it's still early days, on electrolysis of seawater. And it's not that seawater is more difficult to electrolyze, it's because of all the salt that's in it, and the impact, I think, basically all the minerals in seawater have on the electrodes in the electrolysis system. But so seawater electrolysis is potentially part of the future as well. So I don't see there's a paradox there. It may be, there may be a few special regions where it's problematic, but I don't think so on a broad scale because of the amount of water we use for other things. And of course, you get all the water back again when you combust the hydrogen. And I know it goes into the atmosphere, but then it rains. So,
which we are needing a lot in Brazil now, David.
Yes, definitely.
Look, there's another question from London here. It's from Mr. Tiago Maranhão Alves, the CEO of Solar Americas, based in London. Considering it's about Brazil, considering solar is the biggest resource at all scenarios, and considering how solar is underdeveloped in Brazil, what is Shell's view on participation on the solar sector in Brazil?
I can't answer that specifically for Shell because I'm not involved in the solar business on a day-to-day basis. But his observation is correct. Solar plays a very large role in the scenarios. And it plays, if you look at the data for Brazil, it plays a fairly important role in Brazil as well. Not quite as important as other areas, because Brazil has a very large natural resource for generating electricity, which is hydro. It also, I think in the Sky scenario, makes significant use of biomass for delivering electricity, and using carbon capture and storage to deliver negative emissions. So if I recall, Brazil then becomes a large seller of international carbon sink credits. So solar is important, but not quite on the scale as in other countries, simply because of Brazil's natural resources that exist anyway, not because of for no other reason.
Thank you, David. Look, we still have time for one or two more questions, right? I'll make mine now. Look, this is something that worries me a lot. You know, it's been a long time. It's about governance. I saw the videos, I read all the material, the very rich material in the Shell site. And there, I think it's Jeremy, he speaks about ambitious orchestration of government policies, investment, and sector cooperation.
Yep.
You know, industry, government, society working together. But you know, ETS, emission trading systems, are coming very slow, right? I don't see, it's a comment, but it's a question. I don't see it happening in the speed, because speed is crucial now, in the speed that it should be happening. I know that there are crises, there are shocks, you know, that can galvanize, you know, people around the goal of, let's say, Sky 1.5. But, you know, could you elaborate a little bit about the mechanisms, you know, to put it all together? And it worries me a lot, especially in emerging countries, you know, where these mechanisms of governance are less developed. Could you speak a little bit? Because I think this is crucial, you know,
yes,
for
no,
speed.
I agree. I mean, it's useful to just look at the EU emissions trading system that, you know, we forget that it's already 15 years old. And so I've been looking at climate change in Shell for 20 years. And when I came into this area, one of the very, very first things that I remember appearing on my desk was the draft directive for the emissions trading system, which the Commission had put out for comment. And that was in 2001. So 20 years later, the emissions trading system has finally got through all of the problems and all of the teething issues that it had, and has turned into a very effective and useful tool. And you see the price today is around 60 euros, driving real change across Europe. But that's taken 20 years. Now, I think there's a lot to learn from Europe, and there's a lot to, and so you could hopefully build much faster in other places. But I agree with your observation that the rate of change is falling far short of what's necessary. In some countries, I don't think that the carbon pricing mechanism like an emissions trading system is going to emerge, because as much as it's the right economic tool to use, it's become a very toxic issue.
Yes.
My own country, Australia, carbon pricing on again, off again, on again, off again. It's a toxic issue. And I, you know, the government of the day is probably not going to implement it, but the current opposition may not implement it, because then they worry that they're not the government next time around. They get voted out. So, you know, Australia is probably going to have to look at other mechanisms now, more mandate driven, more standards driven. So mandating the use of electric vehicles, putting emission standards into the power generation system, or renewable electricity requirements. These give you an implicit carbon price, but they're not as economically efficient as the explicit carbon price that comes, for instance, through an emissions trading system. So we end up getting there. We get there a bit late. We get there in a less economically efficient way, but we still get there. And I think that's the message in all of the scenarios. I think on the current pace of change, it's hard to see the stretch goals of the Paris Agreement being met. But equally, I think you have to be optimistic that, even in the wave scenario, you see rapid change over the next 50 years. And even in the island scenario, which was really lagging, you do see considerable change. It's just not nearly fast enough. So I think there's room to be optimistic, and there's room to imagine that this pace of change continues to accelerate, because we weren't even imagining 10 years ago that all these scenarios would get to net zero emissions. If you look back at the IPCC 5th assessment report and 4th assessment report, they're talking about fossil fuel emissions doubling and tripling. And I just don't think that's on the agenda anymore. So I think you need to be optimistic, even though the pace of change today is not fast enough.
Yeah. So, David, unfortunately, we come to an end, I have to close it. I just wanted to remark that for more information, though they asked me to say that for more information about in Shell Brazil, about the solar business, please, I put the email of gabriela.oliveira@shell.com, gabriela.oliveira@shell.com, for those more interested about solar business in Brazil, Shell. And there's also a question here, which is more specific. I'll just mention it, about an estimate of the total hectares needed for solar energy in the scenarios.
It's relatively small, but I just want to say a word about one other question, which was about tipping points.
Yep.
So our modeling of the climate, of the temperature impacts is not done by Shell, it's done by MIT. And so they remodel our scenarios in their global climate model. And so at least to the extent that they have been able to model tipping points, which they try and do, although they may not have covered all of them, we believe that what we're showing is the result of good climate modeling, not just an assessment based on carbon in the atmosphere. So I think it does include all of the issues that our colleague Bob from the British government has mentioned.
Thank you very much, David. I'm closing it now.
Good.
It's very good to see your face, to hear your voice again.
Pity I'm not in Brazil, but nevertheless, we could go for a good lunch now, but not to worry.
Look, thank you. Say thanks at start to everyone as well, to Ana Paula, to the Britcham's associates, Bruno, Carlos, Vlamir, Renato, the Shell team, the Britcham team, to André Araújo, and to you, David. Thank you very much indeed for this session here with us. It's one of the most important ones in the year. And I hope that I can have you next year with us, or even sooner than that, if possible. Right? And please, to everyone, do not miss next Britcham events at www.britcham.com.br. And I'll finish it I always finish with this phrase, David, it's for you and to everyone. Stay well and healthy, you and yours, internally and externally. I wish you all the best, David and everyone. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.